So I will introduce our guests, and we are very appreciative that they're here. We have Joe Cronin and Elaine Griffin from the Office of Grants Facilitation. And so we've asked them to come here and talk to you guys a little bit about grants and the grant process to help you out. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Carrie, so much. My name is Joe Cronin. I'm the director of the Office of Grants Facilitation for the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences and the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment. I'm joined by my colleague, Elaine Griffin, who is, Elaine will introduce herself.
I'm a research grant and contract specialist with the office. Our job is, think of like Grand Central Station. That's kind of the feeling of our office sometimes. We catch you wherever you are going in your travels. We try to make sure that you're on the right train, your luggage is with you, make sure you arrive safely.
The basic description of our office is that we are the pre-award office, and that encompasses the entire gamut from helping people find ideas, generate ideas, to all the way to helping you get your proposals out the door to your federal, private, and state funding agencies. This campus is particularly productive. We have approximately 700 or so applications go out each year from our faculty, staff, and researchers. I believe, we used to account for, and I don't know if the number still holds, but this campus accounts for approximately 1/3 of all research revenue brought into the institution. So SEBS and NJES folks, I think, have a lot to be proud of. With that being said, the focus of this presentation today is to help you sort of get your feet wet in the grant world and what you can do to start to become more effective and more hopefully even aggressive, if that's the right word, grant writers. With that said, today's agenda is Elaine's going to start off, and she's going to talk about Grant Basics 101, things you need to know. She's going to talk a little bit about the different funding mechanisms that are out there. I'm going to go ahead and talk about grant writing, things that you need to know, some basic tips for that, and also talk to you a little bit about once you have the proposal written and once you have your idea written, how do you go about getting money? And one of the first ways that you should do that is by starting to communicate with your sponsors. And I'll give you some tips and some basic tools for things you need to know in terms of when you make that first outreach to a sponsor. Because the first time you make an outreach to anybody to ask for money, there's always this feeling that it can be awkward or it can be a little bit almost embarrassing. Especially if you're going for maybe a smaller private foundation or a smaller organization. Some of the stuff that we're going to talk about in terms of tips and tools is really more geared toward that realm as opposed to the larger federal funding, and we'll talk about that a little bit throughout, why that is. The main reason is that obviously with federal funding, the federal agencies have their own specific set of rules and guidelines. So what NIH rules and guidelines are going to be very different from what NSF rules and guidelines are going to be, even opposed to what USDA rules and guidelines are going to be. So our approach is more of a generic, things that you can do to become more effective and even better writers. So with that said, I'm going to turn the mic. We're sharing a mic.
We'll return it, I promise.
We will return it. We don't want to walk off with it.
Hi, everybody. Hi. Is that all you got for me? You just ate. Hello, everybody. Okay, I know you guys are familiar with this grant, but have any of you ever worked on a grant before? Or do you even know what we're talking about? Did you come for the pizza? Okay, so I'm going to start from the very, very basics, okay? And believe it or not, you're further along than some of our faculty when they get here. Some of our faculty need to learn what a grant and a contract are. So we're going to kind of go over some of the basics tonight. We're going to try to answer any questions that you have. After this, I know you're going to want to do this, so we'll try to be a resource to you in your research travels, and I look forward to connecting with you guys outside of here. Okay, if you're not familiar, grants are actually a very important thing. That's how we pay for research here at the university. However, it's an implicit or an explicit agreement or contract with whoever your funder is. Your funder is also known as a sponsor, okay? Grants can carry a lot of responsibility. And sometimes there are grants that if you don't use the funds, you are expected to return it to the sponsor. The wonderful thing about sponsored research is most sponsors do not want your money back. So it's really, if you're asking for a certain amount of money, it's your responsibility to spend it. If you go off course in some way, and that does happen sometimes, it's your job to communicate as a principal investigator that there has been a problem in your research. The time to do it is not when your grant is actually coming to an end, 30 days before you close out, I always say, think of it almost as a relationship. If you want them to fund you again, good communication starts from the very beginning. One of the things that I've learned over the years is I like to find out how this relationship's going to work. When I get funded by a sponsor, I find out right away what their expectations are beyond the contract that comes to the university. Are they expecting interim reports? Do they want phone calls every once in a while? If there's a problem, do they want me to try to solve it, or do they want to be involved with the solution? When I've done that, and I've had projects sometimes go off the rails, I mean, sometimes you just can't help it. They know about it, they help me solve the problem, and there's no surprises, and there's no backlash from the university, okay? I've even had projects that work so well that they've waived the final report, which is like the best thing that can happen on a project. Because by that point, you should be moving on to another contract or a grant. So I would tell you, good communication is like anything else. I always start with a phone call. If I need to follow up with an email, I do that, especially if we have agreed to something. If they owe me something, I also follow up that way as well. But I want to make sure that it's a relationship that works for both of us. We want to make them look good, but we also want to look good ourselves. So I try to treat it two ways. Okay. A grant is going to have a start date and an end date. There's expectations in terms of the work that you're proposing. You have financial and programmatic responsibilities when it comes to spending, reporting, obligations. And sometimes when you write the proposal, maybe 9 months before you even get the money, and all these ideas sounded great while you were writing the proposal at midnight. Then you get the money and you're like, oh no, I actually have to do this work. And then that's the time where it's kind of too late at that point to start negotiating things, right? So what you want to do is you want to make sure that if you had a different team when you wrote the proposal and you get the money and then that team has evolved, moved on, you're stuck holding the bag, you want to make sure that the sponsor's aware. And at that point, sometimes you can modify the scope of work. I always just say to people, the sooner the better, and show that you've tried to do some problem solving before you start throwing problems at a sponsor. But the point is, with a grant or a contract, it has to come through our office, and it has to go through the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs, or corporate contracts if it's a corporate entity, because we can't just modify things on the fly. They're not handshake deals. These are things that they can come back and audit us for, and sometimes even worse. What happens, when you accept the responsibility of a grant or a contract, you're accepting responsibility for everything, okay? The university is allowing you to do the work. If you don't complete it, it really looks bad for the institution and anyone else that's working with you. And it tarnishes your reputation as a researcher. So we always say to people, come to us if you get to that point, and we'll figure out what we need to do to help you. But we are primarily a pre-award office. Okay, so where do you get started? I find it's easier with anything, kind of like the way you would bake a cake, start with a recipe. Okay, you're gonna start obviously with a request for an application, or sometimes it's called, it could be a request for application, it could be a request, a sponsored research request. There's all different types of things that we're looking for. But start with what their guidelines allow, okay? But you need to have ideas before you do that. It's always a good idea to get funding for things that a sponsor is looking to fund. And the way that we look at federal sponsors is we actually look at what their strategic plans are. A lot of strategic plans come out about every 4 years, okay? And one of the things that I do in the months where I don't have as much work when I'm working on proposals is I have a drawer of unfunded objects, the UFOs, things that I would like to do that I don't have money for, okay? And I know what they cost, and I know what it takes to implement them. I may not have the proposal fully evolved, but I have something kind of thought through. You can do this on I've even done it on the back of a bar napkin. I've done it on the back of a menu. I've done it on the back of a sticky notes. They tend to go flying away. The point is, I kind of know where I want to go, okay? And it usually starts with some type of objective, what your goals are, what your needs are. I try to think in terms of short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals. Try to see if there's a relationship with other projects. This can easily be done sometimes with doing a literature review. And again, some of the same things you're probably already doing. I want to see if there's anything we can align with other types of goals. I also want to make sure with any kind of idea that it's specific, meaning to the sponsor, to the work you know how to do. You can measure the work. You have the ability to achieve it. You'd be surprised. Be realistic, and it's time bound. I can do it within the time frame that I said I could. So when you're trying to flesh out your idea, besides the bar napkin or the back of the menu, you want to make sure that you actually have a problem that you can solve, okay? as you think of framing out your proposal, you're actually putting together essentially your work plan. A very well-written proposal will lend itself to the final product. If you go off course, it'll be very obvious as well. So I always say to people, when you look at your proposal and you start to think through your timeline, as soon as you get off track, it's very hard sometimes to get things back on track. Kind of like your own research when you're doing your graduate research. So it's important that you think about who's going to benefit from the program. And again, this element will end up in the proposal at some point. Overall, what your project's going to accomplish. You want to think about how you're going to measure those accomplishments, okay? And that'll help you with some of the measurable outcomes. And is there a possibility to replicate this beyond the grant funding? Funders want to see that once they give you the money and the money goes away, that it has the capacity to actually sustain beyond their funding. That's a wonderful thing. And then sponsors also see that the money's been leveraged to do other wonderful, projects. And again, Dr. Kopp had mentioned today, if you're doing any kind of articles, reference the C2R2. That's a great example of showing the leverage of a grant. When you're developing project goals, it's important to think through the broad purpose and the impact statements. They actually matter. You have to capture the imagination of the reader. I make it so that they don't want to put down the proposal. One of the ways to do that is make sure you've actually read the entire request for proposal and make sure it's something that they're interested in. There's nothing worse than taking the time, because these applications can take anywhere from 80 to 150 hours for federal proposals. Now, as you do more of them, it shouldn't take you that much. If it is, you got another problem going on. But you should allow enough time. You also should eventually, over time, develop really good material, stock paragraphs. It's always important if you're going to recycle material that it doesn't, because certain sponsors are expecting certain language. There's a flavor for National Science Foundation. There's a flavor for the United States Department of Agriculture. They don't really sound the same, not usually. If you have a good list of referee journal articles, think about keeping that list pretty current, especially if you have different topics within research. Those things are really, people burn so much time on those things. Even if you think about the other pieces you're going to need, your CV should be up to date. Current and pending, which is what a lot of federal sponsors require. You want to make sure you've included that opportunity that you're actually applying to on that particular document, because I've seen people go out the door with great ideas, and that's one thing that was overlooked. They're nodding, this is true. Probably more often than not. I always say to people, make sure you've got a very up-to-date version of any of those documents. Make sure you keep it under lock and key. Don't let other people access it. Put it in a safe place you're not going to access it any other time. As you do things, as you publish, as you finish projects, as you present, continue to update it. Don't wait until a grant is due to work on that. What I also always tried to do is, if I need to have any kind of statements, any type of, institutional capacity, I think about that months before I even apply for a project. I think about what resources are at Rutgers. So when I assemble a grant, I don't need 150 hours because I've got really good material to work from. And again, part of it's just building your repository. You can jump in at any point, by the way. All right. But it's also important to display, how your project that you're proposing is better or different than what's currently being done. Knowing what's going on around the country, around the world, is a very good thing. The last thing in the world is you want to come up with an idea that's already been done 10 years ago, okay? So it's important to really understand the world around you. And you want to make sure that you actually relate your project goals to very specific objectives. Okay, I always say to people, right after that, you should be starting to think, if you got awarded tomorrow, what do you need to think about? You learn the most from a project going off the rails. I really, really think you do. But I don't want that for anybody here. You have to really think about timing. Some projects don't come in when you think they should. And it's important, especially when you start building your budget, to think through what a year looks like versus a quarter. I try my best when I can is not to assign things to months, but rather think in terms of chunks of like a quarter. It's much easier to get it done in 3 months than it is in 1 month. It's also very, very important to think through the work plan and making sure that it's very clear what your activities are, what outputs they can expect, a clear timeline, and your budget should kind of match. If you start throwing things in there that have nothing to do with the project, your sponsor will realize it. I heard a figure years ago, and I think it's a really sad figure. But 80% of proposals do not get approved because they didn't follow directions. So knowing all the hours you might have spent on a proposal and to find out if something's simple. I mean, there are grants out there that ask you for 12-inch font, 1-inch margins, a very specific way that the title page should look. That's the best way to get rid of a bunch of proposals. And some of these teams are volunteer. So they're reading, and I always say to people, write as if you had to get stuck reading this. Make sure that you follow the directions. It's very simple, but believe it or not, it's not always the best ideas that get funded. It's the ones that can follow directions. Because what that it shows is you have the ability to perhaps manage the grant. And it's really that simple. They make that correlation. I've seen projects where I'm really surprised that they got funded, but then I look and I said, okay, well, we missed a page, or we missed, a requirement. And I'm like, we had a better idea, clearly, but we actually missed an important detail. There's nothing worse than that, because then you usually have to wait another year if they actually have the same announcement. So, just be mindful of that. I almost think about taking the back of it on the scoring section, almost like the rubric in a class. That becomes your outline. They know what they want to see. I always say to people, don't offer things that they're not asking for. If they have more questions, they come back. And it's important that, again, you follow the rubric that they put there. They know what points should be assigned to each section. A lot of grants will tell you. Make sure if you have partnerships in your research, make sure that it's more than just a handshake or a phone call or a weird email. Make sure if they're committing some level of commitment, it's clearly delineated within any letters. Some grants actually require a match. And match is very important to think about. It's actually real money, especially when it comes to a university. If you're going to work with an external partner group when they're a nonprofit organization and they're going to give you volunteer hours, there is a way to calculate the hours that are given to a project. But the time to do it is not when you get audited. So I always try to make sure if I expect them to have information like logs in terms of volunteer hours, that I show them what I need. And I collect that on a quarterly basis. And in fact, if they're a subcontract within the grant, I make sure that that comes along with their bill. So that way I catch them, and again, the most I could lose is a quarter of the project. I also think it's a great idea if you do get awarded that you actually read the contract. Mistakes can often happen. Sometimes amounts are wrong, sometimes dates are wrong. I've seen PIs that didn't apply for the opportunity to be listed on there. And again, make sure, and you're not going to be the one to sign it if it's coming through the university. The university will sign on your behalf, but make sure you've read anything that's coming through. Make sure you also still have the capacity to do the work. I cannot stress this. This is probably the most important thing. Your reputation's all you got, and you have to deliver what you said you're going to. If you're the PI and you've worked with other people, you're still left standing with that responsibility, whether or not people come and go. Be sure to make sure that this is good work. Impacts and evaluation. That can lend to your next round of funding. So one thing I always say to people is think as if this thing has the potential for 3 to 5 more years, okay? You want to make sure that you actually provide the expectations that the sponsor is expecting. If they're beneficiaries of this project, make sure that you clearly tell what was gained by this particular project. You want to make sure if you have if you've set milestones or accomplishments, that you actually meet everything that you said you're going to do. You want to make sure that you're making adequate progress. I even sometimes use a Gantt chart. I don't know if you guys have heard of a Gantt chart. I'm like the micromanager of projects because I think for me, I like the visual organization of knowing what's going on in what quarter. I run colors. Everyone makes fun of my organizational skills for this, but I got to tell you, I know what I'm supposed to be doing, and my quarterly reports look the same. I make sure that I have a way to evaluate any of the impacts, okay? So if, for example, you get money to do, let's say you're doing a survey. I want to make sure that I actually have obviously worked with the internal review board, which is the way that we work with human subjects at the university. My protocol makes sense, the questions make sense. And I want to make sure that I don't vary the way that I ask the questions. If it's a written one or if I have them spell out a survey monkey, I want to make sure that I'm using those same things when I'm looking at the statistics on the project. I also try to make sure, since I'm not a statistician, that I've built in money for my budget for someone who actually knows what they're doing, okay? Excel sheets are great, but you can make lots of mistakes. I'll give you an example. We recently saw a project a few years ago where we had some students going in the field taking data, and they were actually looking at agricultural produce. And there's a difference between a 0 and a dash on a spreadsheet. And we were trying to figure out what was going wrong, because there were lots of, they described it, outliers. The outliers shouldn't be most of your work. Okay, so I knew enough in statistics. Dr. Cronin actually taught statistics, so I definitely knew that didn't sound right. But one of the things I said was, what is the value of 0 on this spreadsheet? Oh, it just means I didn't collect the data. Well, that would explain it. I said, okay, what about leaving it blank? Well, that means that I didn't look at it. Okay. So, and I said, well, was there a protocol when the work was being, kind of collected, data was being gathered? No, we just kind of went out there and all did our own thing. And it looks like it. And I'm like, so what do we do with this? Unfortunately, you can't just go back out into the field and start collecting new data. Some of the produce will be, withered and gone. And I said, is there any way to kind of light a torch and hope for the best? It was bad. It was really, really bad, and the sponsor was expecting results. So I always assume that if I have people working for me and I want a certain outcome, I expect to give you the roadmap so it's very clear. I also spot check any of the work that's coming in to make sure you still follow the protocol. I worked for a supervisor who would make me recite the protocol by memory. I mean, that's overkill. But the point was, I had to script it every time. Didn't matter how many times I delivered the same set of things, I had to read it to the person. And this was a project where I interviewed 500 people. But she wanted to make sure all the data that was coming back could be used. That's especially important on questionnaires and any time that you're going to work with human subjects. You want to also think about, when you think of impacts, you want to think of obviously economic impacts, any kind of financial impacts, social impacts, environmental impacts. These are all wonderful things, and these are bragging rights for any sponsor. You want to make sure you can actually have real numbers. Knowledge gained is important, but it's very hard to I always say to people, there's qualitative research and then there's quantitative research. Know the difference. And make sure that your project has the ability to be replicable somewhere else. There was a project that I worked on. It was one of those grants that, when you start working on something and you don't think it's going to pick up any legs, and you're like, all right, I'll just put a good effort in. This project not only got funded, but it's still going on, and it's been 6 years since I left it. It's still alive. So this was a project I started 10 years ago. I thought it was a pretty good project. Did I think it had the long life that it did? Absolutely not. I just it pays my salary. And when I started looking at this project, it is still going on, and they haven't really deviated from the original model. I don't know why. But again, these projects can often outlive even your own expectations. And different groups have taken it on, and it is still a priority for a federal agency. Also important, I always say to people, you don't have to be a public relations person or a marketing person to know how to keep a sponsor happy. You want to be able to let them know that the work that they've paid for, the C2R2 NSF grant, that it's very, very important. Any chance you can to promote the outcomes of your project, it's a very good thing for a sponsor. They love it, okay? Whether it's an article in the paper, whether it's, press on a website. Anytime you can acknowledge, even a poster that you're presenting at a conference, that's great exposure. If someone gave you money to do the work, you have to let people know, okay? And then make sure they get a copy of whatever had their name on it, and make sure that, and again, they'll sometimes even give you logos to use as well. But there are some rules, actually. If you are using a federal agency's logos, be sure you have permission to do so. They probably need to see it ahead of time and allow for time to do that. But I also try to use that as opportunity to get more money, because I want to show, look what we did with this money and what we can do with other opportunities. There's been grants that have kind of built off each other in the sense where it's very different concepts, but what I've said is, look how successful this project was. I think we can do this for your project as well. And sponsors really eat that up. So I always try to find ways to, if I had a really good roadmap, I try to find ways to incorporate it again. But probably the best way to get started on any grants is learn from other people's successes. Make sure that if you're going for a sponsor that you've never had experience with before, see if anyone's willing to share a copy of a funded proposal with you, so you can actually take a look. The first proposal I ever worked on was actually 20 years ago. And I was like the lowest man on the totem pole. My job was to count pages. And years ago, you didn't submit it electronically. So for what it's worth, you had to provide 10 copies of a proposal, and you had to use a rubber band to actually bind the proposals. You couldn't use a paper clip. It was that specific, USDA. And my job was not to provide scientific content, and it really wasn't to provide any of the outputs of the project. My job was to make sure we didn't duplicate pages and make sure every piece was there. Okay, 10 sets of copies, 200 pages each proposal. And then we drove it down to DC that night. Okay, oh yeah. So I will tell you, if you've got somebody that's really good on the details, that is right there, very important. Make sure that you actually have really good inspiration for your proposal. There's lots of great ideas out there. I mean, when I started working on grant proposals 20 years ago, the internet was not what it is right now. You guys have very valuable resources. I also try to look for the potential to be able to actually publish from anything I do. There's not a project that I would take on a grant that I don't see some type of academic scholarship for it. And I also look for ways to collaborate. But again, I'm more guarded with that because when you collaborate, usually it costs you money. But more importantly, you want to make sure that the work that they produce is very similar to the work that you produce. And you have the same expectations. Okay, with that, I'm going to move on to the next section. This is more fun for us. How you find money. Okay, so as I said, government grants and contracts, they take a long time to assemble. Your first one is going to be, and I hate to say this, more like 80 to 150 hours if you've never done this before. And that's a lot of time, okay? That's uninterrupted time, that's time away from your family, it's kind of like dissertation or research that you have to do, okay? You have to think through in terms of making sure that the work you're proposing is something you can actually do. A good way to start, I always say to people, if you're going to try to go for a federal proposal, if you don't have a copy of one that's been funded, sometimes you can actually sit there and offer to read applications for a federal agency. They're always looking for reviewers, and that's a really good way to get familiar with them to see what kind of work is going to be funded, especially if you don't plan to go out the door right away. But another thing to also think about is if you look at who got funded in the past and try to kind of stalk them and figure out through Google what other things happen as a result, you can also, I mean, you can even sometimes find proposals on the webs. It's amazing what people actually share on the webs, on different websites. Sponsors are also known to sometimes give out funded proposals. Or you can actually call, if you see a university got funded, you can actually call and just try to trace back who that professor was that wrote the proposal. And sometimes they'll be willing to share it, or at least something from the actual project. As I had mentioned, there's request for application, sometimes it's called request for proposal, notice of funding available. They all mean the same thing, essentially. It's really the guidelines of how you're going to apply for an opportunity. Okay, but not everyone's ready for federal. Because federal, I mean, like I said, that's cutting your teeth on some hard stuff, okay? Sometimes it's easier to get philanthropic opportunities, and I actually have experience with not even just federal, but I actually have written grants for nonprofits for many years, so I have a hand in both worlds. They vary. The first grant I wrote for a foundation was actually for, ready for this, an air conditioner. I knew nothing about air conditioning, but I knew I worked for a nonprofit and they needed one. And they said, can you write a grant? And the answer was like, sure. I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, other than, reviewing other kind of federal proposals. I took an application, it was a one-pager. I submitted it and it was funded on that. This is the easiest thing I've ever worked on. It never happened like that again, okay? It was a good one to cut your teeth on though. But it was actually for the Hyde and Watson Foundation. And they're a foundation located up in the north part of the state. The grant was actually for the New Jersey Museum of Agriculture, which is now closed. The board had, it was a $17,000 expenditure to fix an air conditioner, and we had lots of programming going on for students that summer. And we needed it to be fixed literally within 3 months, and we just didn't have it within our budget to fix it. So I filled out the application. I made sure I had 3 quotes from different vendors of what it would cost. I know nothing about air conditioning. I only knew if it was hot, I wanted to turn the air down. That's all I needed to know. But I also talked about the impact that it would have with having a cool room for the students coming in from Newark and Camden. I focused on the human dimension of the proposal. They funded it, no questions asked. All they wanted to see was a picture of the installed air conditioner. That was my final report. Ta-da! It was impressive. They don't all work, they actually unfortunately don't all work that way. But when you have family foundations, sometimes the board is comprised of relatives, okay? I always try to say, because foundations have to be public, you can actually get information that would actually surprise you. If you have a net idea at Rutgers, you can actually go into foundation directory, and you can actually look at people's 990s for different foundations, which will give you a really good idea of what they fund. To show you dollar amount, what year, who it went to, and then again, go onto Google, start searching, play detective, and you can kind of trace it back. The worst thing you could do is apply for something like, let's say you're asking $25,000, but they only give out a $1,000 grant. You kind of look silly. So, and sometimes, unfortunately, websites are outdated. So don't just assume if you saw it on the web or in a printed directory that they're still around. 990s will be about a year, usually about a year back if they file their taxes when they're supposed to. Sometimes they don't. But it'll give you kind of an idea, and also how healthy they are as a foundation. You can actually see all the money that they have, and you can do some analytics. But they range in size. There are grants for $100, there are grants for multi-million dollars, and everything in between. It really can be that diverse. There's a lot of opportunities for fellowships, believe it or not. So, while you're in graduate school, think about that. There is opportunities within foundations. When you're submitting to a foundation, interestingly enough, some of them really don't know what they need or want. I've applied to lots of them where there's no RFP. So where do you start? So there is actually a thing called the Common Application for the State of New Jersey. And while it's not a most impressive document in the world, it kind of gives you the landscape of the things that you need to think about when you're applying for a grant, and it will ask you different things. Now, obviously, as an individual, you may not have all the resources that someone that's, part of a university would have, but you fill out what you can. You do your best. And again, if something's not applicable to the work that you do, you just put NA, okay? If there's a lot more NAs than content, then you probably will not be selected for funding. But it's important to know that these are, a lot of the printed directories are outdated. It is important to connect with a program officer. It's never polite to ask people for money if they don't know who you are. It's just not right. I wouldn't start with a phone call because that's weird. You can start with a letter of intent to apply for a grant. That's a one-page introduction, and you can include as much as you want with that. They still may make you fill out an application, but I've actually had sponsors fund me on the one-page application. So like I said, you can always throw in a try. If they do not fund you, sometimes you never hear from them again. It's like a bad relationship, they just kind of go away. Otherwise, they'll give you, thank you for applying, this doesn't really fit our funding research, or we've given out our money for this year. Sometimes you'll get some kind of communication. If you don't hear from them in 6 months, they broke up with you. It's just plain and simple. But while you actually submit your application, it's probably not a good idea to pitch the same application to another foundation because number one, it's kind of tacky. But more importantly, sometimes people sit on multiple boards. And it's, and again, if you're getting money from this, unless you specifically say within the research that it's going to be funded by multiple groups, it's really not, it's not polite to propose an idea to more than one foundation at a time. It's just, you just don't want to do it. But sometimes I actually call sponsors if I want to get funded by an agency, and I chat out my idea. I at least know what I'm talking about. I have like a one-pager in front of me, kind of outlining what I'm interested in, and see if there's a connection. I'll give you an example. We had a project, and it was a water conservation project for the state of New Jersey. And this was a really interesting project. We actually got money from the DEP, which is the Department of Environmental Protection. We got matching money from U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. And you would think $300,000 is a lot of money over 3 years. Well, when Rutgers takes their cut, the overhead, it really goes fast, okay? So that $300,000 went away real fast. Okay, and then you start paying people and forget it. So we had proposed 3 years worth of work, and honestly, the project was probably worth about $500,000, but we only got $300,000 to do it. So obviously you gotta make up the deficit. So one of the things that we knew that we could do really well is publicity, because at the time we were trying to figure out the right partners and how we're gonna show results in New Jersey. And we started to canvass, believe it or not, areas where we knew that whether it was service providers, like water companies, like New Jersey American Standard is the biggest one in the state. They're the biggest water purveyor in the state. We hit them hard. We went to all their service areas, again, let them know about how the wonderful project that we had. We made sure that we hit the Piscataway area because American Standard's located there. And they called us and said, we want to be part of your project. And I was thinking, we really need bathrooms. But I'm thinking, I don't have the budget to be able to buy toilets and urinals and things like that. Now, at that point, we were 1.5 years into our project. So they called me and said, how can we make a difference? And I had just been to a school, it was Belmar Elementary School, where almost every toilet was American Standard. 40 toilets, everything was American Standard. I said, well, if you want to meet me at my school that I'm going to tomorrow, I'll show you what we're looking to do. And I'm thinking, this school shows well, there's lots of cute kids, perfect. They came, they started delivering toilets all around the state. I'm not kidding, $100,000 in toilets. Okay, so my career was in the toilet as well, because that's what I was studying at the time. But the point is, that was money I wasn't counting on. Okay, so that was a great donation. The only problem with it was, of course, there's going to be a problem. The schools did not communicate with the right people that toilets would be delivered. So I got a principal that had called me that the toilets were delivered to their parking spot. And it was bad. and they were wondering when the toilets would be removed. Okay, so then we had to sort all that out. But the point is, they actually contacted us, and so did New Jersey American Water, and they said, well, we can't give you any kind of money. We can let you use our public relations folks. And that's valued at $100,000. So we got really impressive videos. And again, it didn't come out of our project budget, but that's sustainability. and that's the project that still actually got another $300,000, and it's still going on. So, and this proposal that we wrote, I thought it was really good. I didn't realize it would continue to go. But a project that's exciting, that brings people together and has results is the best thing for a sponsor. It was also a project I had to convince the rest of the group because we weren't really doing water conservation, so I had to kind of sell them, hey, listen, we got to do this, there's money there. So it was one of those things, I was kind of the rogue member of the group. and like I said, this project had probably, and EPA actually still talks about this project. Every time we go into a call, they always talk about this project. It still has a life of its own. So like I said, it's very, very important to think about the impact that you're going to have on a project. Okay, and that will be the impact whether it's federal agency or whether it's a foundation. All right, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Hopefully this mic works and it's picking up my voice. Excellent, all right. What I'm going to switch gears and talk to you a little bit about is grant writing, some basic tips, some techniques, things that you should be aware of when it comes time to actually start writing your proposals. We based this, like I said at the beginning, not on one federal agency, but sort of a mixture of all the different federal agencies, as well as what you should know about in terms of reaching out to private, state, and other non-federal entities to get money from. What I want to start off with is just sort of a brief overview of the main parts of a grant proposal. What are some of the core features? Your abstract, your narrative, your objectives, the approach, that is what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, your evaluation piece, which is something people tend not to think about until the very end, and I think that's a huge mistake. You should be thinking about your evaluation piece as you're developing your project, because it's going to have impacts for your budget as well. Your budget is also something that people tend to wait to the end to do, when I think you should really be doing the budget as one of the first things. In some cases, probably the very first thing that you should do is when you have the project formed, start forming the budget, because that's really going to guide what you're going to be able to do and in essence how you're going to be able to do it. So starting with the abstract, everybody here knows what an abstract is. You've all written them. You will continue to write them. In a grant, the important thing that I like to tell people about the abstract is that you have to sell the importance. You have to sell the impact. And that's something a little bit different from what you may be used to writing abstracts for if you were, writing primarily science-based articles, different research papers. You're not used to this. And it's something you do have to orientate yourself. With grant writing, you do have to become a little bit of a salesperson. And you have to do it in a way that's non-obnoxious, which may sound almost like an oxymoron, but it's true. You have to be able to convey your impacts and the benefits of your project in a way that's going to basically sell yourself to your funders. With the abstract, the other important thing to remember is that, again, you're also going to have to talk a little bit about the budget of the project. Some funders you will, some funders you won't. A lot of the federal ones you won't include a budget statement in the actual abstract, but other ones you will. So just again, it's going to vary from funding source to funding source. The narrative is, I would say, probably the piece that you're going to spend the most amount of time on, because the narrative is really the part where you're going to have to sell yourself. With the narrative, what you're going to have to talk about is the need. You're really going to have to sell here the impact of the project. What is the need for this project? And you can demonstrate the need through a variety of ways. I think the best way to always demonstrate need is to really sell it on the human factor. Who's going to be impacted by this project? Who's going to be impacted by this research? And always back that up with statistics. It's always good to get data that can sell your point. If you don't have data, you're dead in the water. So if you can sell the human side of it and say, this is the group this work is important because, and if you can really sell that approach to people, it will go far. Again, with the narrative piece, what you're going to be doing is establishing the problem, talking about why is this problem important? Why should somebody be spending money on you? And you do that, again, like I said, through selling the impacts of the project. You sell the human side of it. Here's what we're going to be doing. Here are the impacts. And also, this is your chance to show off. This is the impact on the science. This is the science of it. This is what's new. This is what's innovative. This is the approach we're taking. Not only are you selling the issue, but you also sometimes have to sell the approach. You have to sell your methodology. You have to sell your credentials. You have to sell the science behind it. If you're unable to do that, nobody's going to give you money. A lot of times, grant proposals, they don't spend a lot. Funding agencies don't spend a lot of time reviewing them. They don't have a lot of time. They literally, some people will review all these things in a 1 or 2 day period, and that's all you have. So if you don't make the first cut, if you're not strong enough, it's going to go in the out pile. So it's extremely, it can be challenging and daunting, but at the same time, there are tips and things that I think are important. And one of the things that I don't think gets sold enough because I've attended seminars such as this before, one of the things I don't think gets sold enough is the idea of selling the overall, what I call the POW piece. When somebody reads this, they should be like, almost like they got like in a cartoon got punched. Like, whoa. And to me, the important thing about that is, again, the human impacts is, how is this going to better society? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what everybody sitting in this room is involved in. How are we going to make society a little bit better? And that's, in essence, what you really have to drive home to your funder. The objective statement is, again, this is the part of after the narrative, you're going to start to talk about what are the measurable outcomes of the study. These aren't your action items. The objective and the next section, the approach, sort of go hand in hand. The objectives are where you talk about your goals. This is what you hope to achieve. You've laid out the problem, you've laid out what you want to do, how you're going to do it, and this is where you really talk about that latter part of this is what you want to find, and this is what your goals are. This is what you want to make happen with this project. The objective statement is an important section because, I think it's important is because you have to demonstrate here that you've identified this problem, and this is how you're going to make a change. This is how you're going to make an impact. And you do that through talking about your goals. The goals of the project are, and they have to be innovative. Your objectives and goals have to be innovative. They have to be new. They have to make an impression. They have to make a contribution to the field in some capacity. The approach section feeds off of that because your approach again talks about the specific activities. So the objective is almost more, think about in terms of when people talk about strategic planning, there's goals and objectives. And then there's the action items. Here we're talking about the action items. This is what you're going to do, how you're going to do it. With your approach, you have to talk about who this study is going to impact. Who are the recipients of this study? Who's going to be impacted by this? You have to make that point clear. You also have to talk about the timeline. The objective and approach sections have to relate directly to your budget. Because here's where the budget starts to come into play. With your objectives and your approach, you're going to be talking about the shoe leather meeting the road, so to say, for the first time. This is where the actual work is going to be done. So with the approach section, what you have to sell is, okay, this is the actual work, and this is where the budget starts to get framed. Because somebody reading your approach section should start to get in their head, okay, this is what it's going to start to look like, and they're going to start to form an image in their mind of what the cost is. That's why I think it's always important to do the budget as you're going along, or even trying to do it early, because the budget will help frame your work. It's going to frame what's available. And a lot of external, nobody ever writes a grant and they go into it saying they have unlimited funds to do the work they want to do. And they can just put a proposal together, I'm just going to do this study, I'm not going to think about the budget, I'm just going to put together and they'll give me whatever they want to give me, and that's going to get it done. The budget is driven by what the sponsor has available and what the sponsor is willing to fund. And a lot of times with budgeting, what you're going to find is you will propose a $500,000 project, and the sponsor will kick it back and say, we're only going to be able to give you half of that, or a third of that, or 3/4 or something. And you're going to have to sort of scramble and say, okay, well, how can I still get this work done on a fraction of the budget? And that's where you have to be creative. And you have to think about, okay, well, what can be cut? Whenever you design a budget, I always like to have sort of an escape plan in the back of my mind of, okay, I can do this, this, and this, but could I possibly cut this as well? Or, I'm going to be getting some summer salary here. Can I really go without a couple $1,000s in summer salary this year? Things like that. Or I've put in for $10,000 for supplies, but I could probably do the same amount of work for $8,000. So again, think about adding, it's not necessarily adding buffers into your budget, which is also a good approach to take. That is, you can't really naturally inflate it, but what you can do is you can be realistic with your budget, which is your budget has to be. But at the same time, you should also be aware that you can also cut corners a little bit, or, maybe buy generic instead of brand name something along, supplies along, something along those lines. The evaluation piece of a narrative. The evaluation piece is a piece, like I said, a lot of people tend to put off toward the very end, or they don't even think about it all until it's one of those things that usually at the 11th hour, people realize, oh, crap, I have to throw in an evaluation piece to my narrative. I think everybody's guilty of it. Anybody who's written a grant will tell you that's happened to them before, or somebody's looked at it for them. If they had somebody review it and say, yeah, but where's your evaluation piece? And most people think an easy step around the evaluation piece is, oh, we'll just throw in a statistician. They'll just do some math for us, or they'll just, the nerds in the back will just crunch some numbers. Evaluation pieces don't work like that. Evaluation pieces is really how, again, this is how you get to show your project or program was effective. This is where you get to say, this is how I'm going to demonstrate program effectiveness. Because nobody wants to give you money for something that isn't going to work. So that's why an evaluation piece at the end of the day is important, because it's your chance to now demonstrate to the funder, you give me this money, and here's how I'm going to demonstrate that you're getting your values worth. I'm going to demonstrate that this program actually works. With the evaluation piece, I always tell people, do it side by side with the approach. So you're thinking of activities or tasks in the field, where as you design each one, how can you demonstrate that that's going to be effective? How can you demonstrate that you're going to collect, or what data will you collect to demonstrate that? And start thinking about that, because that's also going to shape your budget. Because everything, if you don't walk away with anything else this evening, walk away with everything impacts your budget, pretty much. Everything you do, everything you think about your budget is going to drive your project more than you realize. So with the evaluation piece, again, it has to be related obviously to the program, the problem that you're studying. If it doesn't relate to the problem, you're dead in the water. It's going to be related to your budget. It's going to impact your budget. And it's something, again, that you should be doing early on or up front. All right. Budget. We talked a lot about the budget already. I went over Elaine talked about the budget. I preached about the budget. The budget is the project. The first thing I tell people to do is know your limitations. Obviously, every project you do, every grant you write is going to be different. Review the request. If you're responding to a specific request for proposals, if you're responding to a specific funding agency, know what they fund like the back of their hand. Certain funding agencies will not fund certain things. Federal agencies a lot of times will not fund food or entertainment, while private foundations might. Some will fund travel, some will not. It varies on the needs. It varies on the call. Know it like the back of the hand. Also, know your institution's parameters too. With budgets, if you end up working in higher education, for example, or nonprofits, you're going to have to factor in indirect costs. Because guess what? Grants bring money into the university, And that's great, and they bring prestige and research and everything else. But at the end of the day, there is a cost for getting grants. Grants cost money to run. They cost money to administer. They cost money for the buildings. Grants help cover those expenses back through what we call indirect costs. As researchers on grants, you bring some money back into the institution through indirect costs. But that's also something that you have to be aware of what your parameters are. For example, here at Rutgers, if you're doing research on campus, or what's considered on campus, there's an additional 55% that you have to factor into your budget. So if the parameter is only $200,000 on a budget, that's not 55% on top of the $200,000. That's 55% within that $200,000. Okay, so that's already more than half has to go back to the house.
It doesn't matter the dollar amount of the grant. We've had
Yeah.
grants that are as little as $5,000 to a killer to your budget.
It is a killer, and offices like ours recognize that, but we also recognize that there's a business factor here, and there's a cost to doing business and a cost that we have to be aware of. Just be aware of things, you have to pay indirect costs on grants. The other thing, if you are paying for personnel on grants, you have to pay fringe and benefits. So healthcare benefits covered on grants. You have to pay a percentage of that. That's going to be an additional more than 50% of the personnel costs, in some cases, are going to go toward fringe. The good news is, grad students, you guys are fairly cheap, so, in terms of fringe.
Except when they have tuition.
Yeah, but it's a whole nother story for another day. So basically, just know your limitations. Know what's going to be realistic. Know what's going to be allowable. Know basically what, I don't want to say get away with, but know what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do, because that's going to drive it. Also, things to take into consideration. A lot of times federal funders will not want to fund a project if there's a lot of faculty salary on it, because their view is, you should be doing this work anyway. We shouldn't be in the salary recovery business for you and your institution. Different funders have different tricks, different things that they're aware of. So just be aware of some of those limitations as well. Some projects won't fund like I said, some projects won't fund travel. Some won't fund computer equipment. Some you may budget to buy equipment, but at the end of the day, it has to go back to the funder, and they own it. So there are rules, things that you should be aware of before you start writing, or things before you go into grants. With budgets, another thing that you should be aware of, and Elaine talked about this, and I don't want to belabor this anymore, is this whole idea of matching, or what we call cost share. In the world, sometimes funding agencies will say, okay, if you apply for this grant, you have to demonstrate what they call, it's also been called institutional match, it's also sometimes called in-kind. It's basically that you have to show that you have skin in the game, so to say. You have to show that you have something to put forward as a match to this project. We're going to give you $200,000, but we want to see at least 50% of that buy-in from your institution. And how you do that is through a variety of ways. Here at Rutgers, how we do it, and every institution is different, but Rutgers has a specific rules and guidelines saying how we do what we call cost share in-kind is through faculty time. So the time you put on the grant, you might not necessarily recover, but you'll be able to use that time toward the match through what they call salary recovery. Also, sometimes on grants, you can use for that salary recovery the indirect costs, what they call unrecovered F&A. So if you're putting forth a project that's $200,000 and you have $50,000 of faculty salary on that, you can easily put the fringe and the indirect costs that are associated with that toward the match as well to help it out. But the thing about cost share that you have to know is that, well, actually two things. It's a major pain to budget for because there's a whole extra layer, as you can imagine, of budgeting. Okay, three things. The second thing is that it's confusing because you're like, okay, I matched on this grant, but my time is here. And it's something related to that is you have to track it. Federal guidelines say that if you put forward a match on a grant, it has to be tracked by the institution. So that means every time faculty do matching, the institution has to keep track of that, and you do that through, reporting your time, reporting your effort, Every time you do a grant, you have to report how much time and effort you put into it. So these are all things that before you start grant writing, you have to, like I said at the beginning, keep in the back of your mind. All right, one tip we like to tell people, again, about writing is everybody will get rejected. It's a fact of life. As sure as the sky is blue and the sun will rise again, you're going to get a rejection notice. It happens. Some things that we like to tell people to sort of buffer that a little bit. You can always recycle grant language. If it was good enough to apply for the first time and you got decent feedback, it's probably worth applying again, but you're going to have to sort of negotiate a little bit. I always recommend, Elaine and myself always recommend a couple things. First thing is try to get your hands on, obviously, what worked, what was successful previously. The other thing we like to tell people to do is reach out to a funder and try to get some further clarification. Find out why, because sometimes you won't get a detailed review. Sometimes you'll just get a letter that says, we're not going to fund you this time, better luck next time. Try to get a little bit more feedback, because a lot of times people will have notes, and obviously they have review committees who looked at these things, and there were notes generated, and there's a review panel, so there's probably some sort of feedback out there that you can get your hands on. It might take a little negotiation and a little, schmoozing maybe, but you could probably get your hands on some feedback at some point. That's always important. And this slide lends nicely to the last section today of some things about communicating with sponsors. Because that itself, I think, can be kind of, like I said at the beginning, can be a little bit daunting and almost a little uncomfortable and almost awkward. Because we're used to this sort of almost cold process of we submit it, almost Orwellian. We submit the grant, and we wait for feedback for it, and we get this autonomous feedback that says yay or nay. Okay? But we tell people that it doesn't have to be that way. It can be a little bit more warm and fuzzy. And there are a couple different ways to do that. One way, I think, to sort of get ready for this, or get ready to speak to a funder is, and Elaine talked a little bit about developing like a one-page letter of introduction, a one-page introduction to a sponsor. Elaine and I also call it the one-page pitch. We've also called it the elevator speech, which is a little bit less than one page. But it's your idea of, it's basically a summary of your work. Before you reach out to a sponsor to either get clarification to see if maybe they're the right fit, or you might want to reach out to a sponsor just to introduce yourself, get a better sense of what their funding priorities are. It's a good idea to have a good sense of what you are and what you can bring to them. And we always tell people the best way to do that is just do a little one-page document. It shouldn't be no more than a page, something they can read quick and easy. Again, it's outlining who you are, what you do, what the impacts are, and also what the costs of this project are. And the funder, when they look at this, should have some basic questions. And they should be able to glean from this, or they should be able to understand things like, well, did they make enough, is the evidence strong enough here? Did they make a valid point? Are the impacts strong? Is this something we really want to fund? Is this something that we feel that we could get behind? Your one-pager should answer all these questions and should really lay out for them a good sense of who you are and what you can bring to their agency. Okay. Now, another way to reach out to a funding agency, again, is just through the standard mechanisms of reaching out to them to get a little bit more feedback, some advice, whatever. And I would say view it as sort of a multi-stage process, because ultimately the end goal here, remove the grant itself, isn't necessarily just getting the grant, but the end goal at this stage should be getting in front of them, which actually many times can be more difficult than getting a grant. Because especially if you go to work with federal funding agencies, they're going to be sometimes, you have to go down to Washington and it's hard to get a hold of them. They're in meetings all day. But with smaller agencies or state agencies, sometimes it might be a little bit easier. But regardless of who it is, Elaine and I always say, kind of view it in terms of a 4-step process. And the first step is, obviously, we talked about knowing who you're going to be talking to. Never go into a meeting blind, not knowing anything or not knowing that much about the agency. Know them better than they know themselves, I always like to tell people. Do your work, do your research on them. I don't want to say stalk them, on social media in this day and age. But I think that's one of the, as we're finding out more and more news, that's one of the things that, one of the reasons why social media actually I think was invented was for things like this. But know your program, know your agency, know who you're going to be talking with. If there's a specific program officer that you have in mind, look into them. See where they did their master's or their doctorate. See what publications they have. See if they were on the faculty somewhere. You know, get a sense of who you're going to be speaking to, and also get a sense of what the grant program is. Take a look at who they funded in the past. Elaine talked about foundations earlier. The easiest legwork you can do is just go onto the Foundation Center directory and download their 990s. The 990s are great. You get to play detective. You can see who they funded over the past, going back 10, 15 years, and gives you a sense. If you know, if, for example, if you're looking at a foundation, and foundations sometimes are very territorial. If they don't fund in, if they say they fund in New Jersey, okay? And you go, oh great, they fund in New Jersey. You go to their 990, and you see they haven't funded in New Jersey in the state since 2008. They're not going to fund you. So get a sense of where they funded, who they funded, because that trends don't change overnight with some of these agencies. They're not automatically one day. You know, we've never given in Jersey before, but I woke up one day and I want to give in New Jersey. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. They tend to be very consistent with that. So know their history, know who they are. The other thing we tell people in terms of the first stage is knowing your grant funder and also knowing your project, but also be ready to modify it. Be flexible with it. Because the funding, like I said, not only with the budget, but also maybe with the scope of the program as well. Because funders may say, we'd like that approach, but what about X? And therefore you can demonstrate a little bit more flexibility to them. Okay, we're willing to look at it from maybe an incorporation of what you had with what they had. So again, learn to be a little bit more flexible with it sometimes.
Can I add something as well? Spell the funder's name right. Yeah, you would be surprised. If it's a Mr. or Miss or Ms., be sure that it's consistent, especially with a common name. If you've used the letter before, be sure to remove any kind of history of the other letter. Sometimes we look at things when people are rushed, and that's when mistakes happen. I always say have someone proofread it that doesn't know really what you do. Look at that. Look for the very simple things that are going to do the impact. I really can't stress that enough. That's really where you get this call.
So the first stage is obviously do your legwork. The second stage we talked about already, I'm not going to belabor it, is develop the one-page pitch, or develop a quick way of summarizing your program. Next, start with an email. Phone, like Elaine said, and I agree with her on this, phone is a little off-putting for these things. Email's a good way. You get a chance in the email, should be a brief email, don't write a long email. They don't need to read your whole dissertation. Start off with, tell them up front why you're reaching out to them, how you discovered them, what you think you can bring, what contribution you think you could bring, and always end it with, I'd like to discuss this more with you. At your leisure, please let me know what you think if we could possibly set something up. The fourth stage is obviously, could be phone, could be Skype, could be in person, but it's getting to talk with them one-on-one. And again, the same thing. By that stage, you've rehearsed this, you know them. At that point, if you get invited, you're ready to talk to them. And maybe it'll be a great fit, maybe it won't, but you won't know unless you do the legwork beforehand. I think the legwork and the time that you have to put into these things is important. I always say, in terms of other things or other tips that are important, I think it's obviously make sure that you can explain it in a manner that's easy to understand, especially if you're going to be looking at grants for foundations and private funding mechanisms. They might be, like Elaine said, they might be family organizations. They might not necessarily truly understand the science involved. Obviously, you want to demonstrate mastery. You want to demonstrate that you're a brilliant scientist, but you can also demonstrate that in a way that's easy for somebody who's a non-scientist to understand. And that sometimes can be a little bit of a barrier.
Sorry, that's they're taking the communication course right now.
Ah, wonderful. Wonderful. You would be surprised how many grants get thrown out the door for not even following simple instructions. Elaine talked about formatting earlier, and it's true. They want to see, if they tell you 1-inch margins, And if it's not 1-inch margins, they will know. You'll be surprised. They will know. They will know what 12-point font versus 11.5 looks like. They know these things.
They also know courier, so that's not even a Be surprised. But,
Yes.
So can you share the story that we had recently where we had a big proposal team work on a federal proposal, lots of hours went on it, and what was the simple mistake made within an hour?
We were sharing the story with Dr. Kopp and others earlier. No, it wasn't. It was nobody's. A big faculty group went out. This is the important thing is one of the important things to walk away from this is take your time. These things have to be well planned out, well thought out, well rehearsed. Don't do anything at the last minute. And this is a good example of something I think that was rushed and was at the last minute. Big grant went out the door. It was I don't want to say the federal funder.
It was multiple.
It was a huge federal funder, multiple millions of dollars, 5-year time span on the grant. It would have brought a lot of money into the institution, would have been a very prestigious project for these folks to work on. The person who was involved at the end of, the faculty member who was involved at the end, I think did it at the very last minute. And probably the day it was due, which is also a mistake you don't want to make. And they submitted the grant. One of the co-PIs brought it down to Elaine and myself and said, yeah, this is the grant that went out. I said, well, what happened with it? He goes, well, my colleague didn't exactly check it. We looked about the third page in. There was, after a piece of the narrative, there was a gap. And font change, big font change, highlighted in yellow and bold. Need more information here.
And they highlight their mistakes. So not
Yeah.
only do they make it, they highlight it.
Federal funding, we can sort of joke and laugh about it, but it's true. They do not play with this. They throw it in the out pile. With NSF, if you have to do data tables, for example, your tables have to be formatted a certain way, have to look a certain manner, have to have spacing exact. If the spacing is not exact, if the lettering is not, if the font's, they will throw it out. NSF, same way. Your CVs have to look a specific manner. And NIH, NSF, they're all different. The current and pending statements are all different. So it's...
Yeah, we also had another one. This is a pretty big one. Grants.gov shut down one time. And that's the worst thing in the world. The day you're submitting, it's due. There's no other extensions that are allowed. We had a situation where there was a really bad storm in New Jersey. The storm had not happened in Washington, D.C. If the federal government shuts down, that's one thing. If it's just the university, that's another. So what happened was we had a bunch of PIs ready to go. We waited until the last minute because faculty are just like you guys. and unfortunately, the day it was being submitted, there was not only technical problems with grants.gov, but the university shut down the operating schedule. So that means that technically no one in the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs could release the application. Okay, so that's the last thing in the world you want to ever tell a team that has spent no sleep in the last 3 weeks working on a proposal that, hey, listen, by the way, all those grad students you thought you were going to fund, you're not. So essentially what happened was we still got them out the door unofficially through the back door, but then grants.gov was doing updates. So we from Rutgers thought we're okay, we're on track, we're going to get them out the door. And at 4 o'clock when this thing was due at 5, we found out that they were updating for the next 3 hours. So, and they would not be, the agency was not going to be able to accept any submissions outside of grants.gov. And that's a big, like, oh no. As it was, it did not get funded because we still submitted late because we still wanted to get out there thinking, all right, everyone else had the same problem. Well, everyone else just planned a little bit better. So just so you know, and again, it was a great proposal. It got funded the next round. But what a blow to the team.
We always tell people, give yourself and your team at least 48 hours before. If it's due on the 15th, get it in by the 13th. Just because you never know what other little barriers, what other things in life are going to pop up at the last minute for you. All right. So with that being said, obviously, as you probably glean from this, the world of grants, there's a lot more that we could have probably teach a whole semester course on this. Not that we're
We're not advertising.
If throughout your studies here, if you ever want to learn more about grants or you start working on a grant, you need our help or assistance, or you're thinking about something, want to bounce ideas off of us, let us know. We have our contact information up there. We're always willing to reach out. We work with faculty, staff, and students. Just reach out, give us a call, drop us an email. Elaine and myself are always always willing to work with members of the campus community. Thanks.
I also want to share the way to speed things up, because bless you, usually when you're looking for money, it's because you really, really need it. If you come prepared, even if it's not the best clean format, with what you're trying to do with some keywords, we can generate a search while you're in the office and let you know, here are some possible opportunities for you, and here's when they're due. If it's something we've got other people doing, the benefit of our office is we see 700 of these things a year. So we know what other people are doing, or if there's a way for you to join the team. So I would tell you, connect with us early. So we, and again, we're like matchmakers, sort of. We will try to find a place for you. Or if there's an opportunity for you to learn from another faculty member, perhaps we can actually match you up that way as well.
Great. All right, thank you.
Are there any questions? There's got to be. Yes.
Do you mind talking a little bit about whether it's scope or theme in terms of like heading towards the foundation versus heading?
How do you know the difference?
Yes.
Okay.
Just like what different groups would be more likely to come?
Do you want me to field it, or do you want to field it?
You feel
Okay.
it, jump in.
Okay. So it's going to depend. I don't need to be, one of those people. Typically, if you read the strategic plans for federal agencies, you'll know if you're a good match. Now, strategic plans usually coincide with president terms. Sometimes not. Also make sure that you've got the most recent version. Sometimes these strategic plans get modified depending who's in the office. That's not the only way though. I started on their website. Federal agencies are pretty good about keeping their websites sort of up to date. Foundations, not always, okay? So what I would tell you is if you've got a great idea, it's possible you want to do more than one project, okay? So for the purposes of the one pager, like that UFO and unfunded object, start with your idea, okay? We can take a look at it pretty quickly because, again, given the volume of our office, to tell you where you might have a good chance to get it, especially for first round. If it's also been done, you might be able to say, well, how do you consider this? Or what if, this looks like something we've seen before. Here's a look, here's some references you might want to take a look at. Another thing to think about is sometimes within RFAs, they actually tell you suggested readings. That's not just there to fill out pages. That's actually there because they want you to actually review it before you even think about applying. Sometimes they just do throw some of those references on there and we're like, okay, that's been going on for about a couple years. But I would just tell you to kind of know your funders inside and out. Also, one of the things I did, I had to stay funded for a very long time. I started on grant funds when I was an undergrad. I actually came back and decided this is what I want to do with my career. So in 2004, I returned to the university. I was grant funded until I took this position in its office in 2013. And I stayed alive for that long. Never had a lapse in employment. And that takes a lot of, you have to reinvent yourself quite a bit. You almost have to become like Cher. Like you just have to keep taking on new lives. An obscure one for you guys. But the reality is you have to not be afraid of going out and trying something different. Because you got to follow the money, right? So what's hot and present day may not be really that important tomorrow. So you got to kind of follow trends. Go to professional conferences, talk to people, look at people's websites here. There are so many amazing researchers at Rutgers, even outside of our school. See what other people are doing. Go to seminars. See what's interesting and start chatting people up. The best way to get experience is to get on a grant. See if you really want to live that lifestyle. Some love it. I thrive with the chaos. Other people just kind of say, okay, that was fun. I found it was actually more, like for me, I like the challenge of getting onto a project that I didn't write and trying to figure out how to make my piece on the project. It was usually like, that's when we had to do some swaps. Okay, we propose this, we're not going to be able to do that, but we got this really great idea. Again, that conversation happened with the sponsor, and it is sales. I mean, Dr. Cronin was right. I mean, sometimes you have to sell yourself, even if you don't really know all the details. You don't want to upsell it to the point where you're really going to put yourself in a worse situation. But you have to be confident when you know what you can bring to the table. And there are transferable skills. So if you've got the discipline that it takes to get your graduate school, you can do grants. You really can. Everyone has to start somewhere. Like I said, starting under someone that knows what they're doing is always a good thing. It's a very specific skill.
Going back to the question about scope, though.
Yeah.
The thing I was going to tell people, as far as that goes, is foundations aren't going to fund in the way that federal agencies do. Federal agencies are going to fund you for multiple years. It's multi-million-dollar projects, $100,000 projects, multi-hundred, close to $1 million or so each year. But smaller foundations, you're going to maybe get anywhere from $3,000 to maybe $35,000, something like that.
Usually your first round.
Yeah.
Pilot programs.
I mean, do it smaller. The larger foundations, I mean,
Yeah.
Gates, for example, larger ones like that, that's, you know, the extremely competitive ones, they're more akin to what a federal agency likes to fund.
Yeah, and then-
But scope is going to be important, especially the first time out, because you might want to start small and build up.
yeah, one of the things we tell people is, especially once you're under a certain threshold, whether it's 3,000, 25,000, you're going to work just as hard to get a $3,000 grant than a 25,000. And you'll have to use a lot more together. What I would always say to you, if an opportunity looks too good, it's probably what you want to pass on. Okay? If this is a project that is going to clearly cost you more than you're getting, you're losing your shirt. Okay? So you have to know when to kind of get in. It's almost like the game of double dutch. You have to know when to jump in on the right opportunity and make sure you've got the time to get it done. There's nothing worse than getting money and not being able to get it done. You see people return money sometimes. It's really a shame. It's hard to get money. But sometimes people just really admit that, like, I don't know what I was thinking, or I wrote this at 11 o'clock and I was desperate, other money came in. You know, it's like a confessional half the day. So, you know, I really don't know what I'm doing on this one. You know, but again, that's why we take a look and say, okay, what pieces are missing? And that's when I said, like, you know, we always try to kind of be the air traffic controllers, figure out where you are. And we always say, just be honest, where are you in your project? What happened? And we can try to help you. Sometimes we can't help you, but we try our best. So if you've got ideas, which I'm sure you do, and you need money to support you so that you're not kind of building your own personal economy, talk to us. See if there's a fit. Help you figure out where to talk to.
I don't know if you're into this one, budgets, but if you're going with a budget timeline or just a budget per grant, do you need to include the university overhead in that? Like,
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. If you're running it through the university and they allow indirect costs, sometimes foundations do not allow it.
Foundations and sometimes state agencies, or even some federal agencies will put in there, they do not cover initial cost. But if you do, and you don't specify a specific rate, or if they say those terms federally negotiated rate, that means full rate.
Right, but the way that you decide whether it's on campus or off campus, if 51% of the work is actually off campus, then it's off campus. If it's off, if you want it off campus, it's a better rate, we get it, but that's not really fly. If you've got a project where the only way you can actually get it done is to reduce the overhead, there is a process to do it, but it's one where under responsible center management, it's much harder to do. So I would just tell you, get to us early. We'll help you figure, we'll even tell you what the F&A rate is, if there's a match. We'll break it down so that all you're really doing, other than kind of, you know, evolving your project, is following the recipe.
Elaine mentioned off-campus. I don't think I mentioned what the off-campus rate was when I'm talking. The on-campus rate, like I said, is 55%. The off-campus rate, which, like Elaine said, is 51% or more of your project or work is being done at a non-Rutgers affiliated site, i.e. another university, you can use a lower indirect cost rate, which is 26%.
Which is a huge savings.
Yeah.
And then there are state contracts that are 10%. There are foundations that are 2%, 5%.
Some federal agencies fund 42.857. I mean,
We
it's-
can't make this up.
Yeah.
And it runs the gamut, okay? So, but it will not, on this campus, exceed 55% as of now.
So, I feel like this would be your work emphasis. If we apply for like smaller travel grants to get there, does that require?
Okay, if you're a SED student, I don't know where your work is being held. If it's School of Environmental and Biological Sciences Research, and you find a faculty member that'll take you in, we can work with you with the RAPS application, and again, we'll work with you in terms of the travel stipends, the travel grants. I mean, you know, and again, the fellowships, things that kind of fall in those categories.
Sometimes with fellowships, though, that you don't have to pay a penny on certain fellowships will not pay.
There's quite a few that
cost.
don't. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are the ones you want.
Also,
But-
and there are certain expenditures that aren't subject to F&A, like
Yeah.
the stipends. You know, if you're getting a C2R2 stipend, that's not in the, and
Yeah.
tuition is not in the F&A.
So we call them below the line expenses. Okay, so in your world, it probably doesn't mean all that much. To a world like yours, that's like the best thing in the world. So that's like participant support. So essentially what happens is it's usually a use or lose category. If you say, let's say for example, you get a grant and your job is to train, let's say 20 people, and you give them each a stipend of $10,000 for their participation, which be a really good project. If you don't get 20 people and you only end up with 16, then you usually can't reallocate that category to another one unless you've got a very specific relationship with the sponsor and they kind of know what's coming. But typically that's like kind of use or lose. So that you don't want that. So if you're going to estimate that and you're not going to have F&A driven on it, you want to be as close to a real number as possible. It's also important with any research, if you're trying to get your graduate work done, build in money for publications and travel to conferences. What great exposure that is. And again, you know, even if it's presenting a poster, I mean, something that you can do, and again, I always think, even your first year, if you get a chance to just go somewhere, do it. Typically, memberships are not really paid for out of a grant. That would come out of a discretionary account. And sometimes the faculty that are sponsoring you would probably help you kind of figure that out in some cases. But professional organizations are a really good networking tool for you.
Like I said, we have our contact information, so if there anybody's in your future questions or help with anything, just
It's a lot.
let us know.
It's a lot of material. We threw a lot at you and you ate, so. And no one fell asleep, so we don't lose anybody.
Win for us.
So one of the things I was doing while you were talking was just writing down things that super duper resonated and contacting the sponsor. Like I always do it. So whenever I see a call for anything, I've never submitted something where I haven't. Maybe sometimes I do a quick email synopsis, offer to talk on the phone. The program officer writes back saying, oh yeah, we'll talk, please call me, or they'll write back being like, oh, okay. You know, and so I sort of gauge the reaction. Sometimes if they're like, oh, please call me, and then I call them, and it is awkward, I don't know what I'm going to say. And then they're like, oh, this would be very competitive if you did X, Y, and Z. And then I sort of weigh that and say, oh, okay. So if I, maybe, what if I tried it like this? Yeah, or not so much, but maybe like that. So we kind of negotiate a little bit the angle that I might take and what they think is important for their profile. Because I think the important thing, and the other thing that really struck me is because I have been a reviewer and quite a bit I've reviewed. And as new faculty, people in the world, if you decide to go that route, you should sign up as a reviewer. You should really remind yourself that that is a good skill and it's good. And if you've got any opportunity to review any kind of grants for smaller organizations or student chapters or things like that, I recommend being a reviewer. But in doing that, I can tell you, because you know, and then you talk to other reviewers in the lunch breaks and things like that, that unless you have, there's two kinds of reviewers. I parsed them into two groups. This is a non-scientific study of reviewers. Some of them are on the senior end of their careers. They are getting close to retired, and they have a lot of time. And so they spend a lot of that time writing out in great detail, you know, every single comment, and they spend in nitpicking. So if your I's aren't dotted and your T's aren't crossed, they catch it. So that's always nice. And then the other kind of reviewer is the one a little more like myself, or more like you know, that kind of new professional signing up to do it, and you've got like 1,000 things to do. And so the idea of like, you know, I'll get assigned 12 to 15 proposals. You do get them assigned a month in advance. I've met some people who actually start reviewing them. But most people are like me, and we're like, okay, we have 4 days to get through all of them. And you usually have to get them done before you show up. You have to write something. And they often
But they do
will
show
say,
up without
yeah,
reading them sometimes.
yes. And so NSF, a lot of their program officers, I think, well, USDA doesn't require it, but NSF did require it for me. And once I did an NIH, and they required it, I had to submit comments beforehand, which was a little bit nice, because it does mean we've all sort of read it. And by sort of, I mean sort of read it, because you're typing, and you have, some of them, I've even said, like, you have to write up to 800 words on this application.
Right.
I don't have that many words to say, you know, so I'm trying to come up with things. So it is this weird game. And to be honest, as I get busier and busier, that 4-day becomes like 2-day, becomes like 1 day, 80 pages per proposal, and I've got 15 to go through. So believe me, I'm looking for key aspects of things that I can grip onto and say this is worth it or not. And because once you get the formula down, I think, and there's a formula to it, you just got to try it a few times, you get it down, then it becomes a game of like, there are way more great proposals that can be funded, And so when you say the nitpicking and the throwing things out, it's because we're all desperate to do it. We want to find any reason not to fund this person, because it is so hard to decide when you get those good applications in that I'm just like, well, they're all great. So, oh wait, they didn't do this right. Great. We don't have to fund it. We just tell them come back next time.
And you don't have to read it either.
Yeah. I look for any excuse, any conflict of interest. And it's like, I visited that place once. Do I have to read this proposal? So there's a lot of that we're trying to do, and there's a lot of us doing it. And so it gets really, really hard. So up front, in bold, you say, I wrote it. But you know what? I have seen people say things, and you know how faculty members are. They can be wrong. So sometimes they'll say something like, well, this person didn't say this, this, and this. And I'm like, oh, well, they did on page 4, right? Well, not, and so it's not like they change their mind. So if you have something important worth saying, you should be saying it more than once. You should really be stressing it a few times so it really pounds it into our head.
That is great. Every section should flow from the other, and when it's disjointed, it's really obvious.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, because, and you may feel like you're losing your mind, and you are, because you're writing a grant proposal. But the reality is, if it was worth saying the first time, it's probably worth saying again, if it makes sense.
Yeah. You don't want to be repetitive.
Yeah.
You don't want to copy the same sentence, but you do want to make that point. And I always like to think about it, like, because I'm forced to sometimes write it in their words, I want the proposer to tell me what I should be writing. Mm-hmm. And so as I think about what I'm submitting, I often think about what do I want them to be saying about my proposal. So I'm giving that repeated message over and over again. And the message has got to be not just like, yeah, it's a good idea, or yeah, it's a solid idea. It's got to be like, I get that there are a million great ideas. This idea is essentially to be funded now. So that's the real case. It's not about making a sell for your idea being important. It's a sell for making your idea be the most important. And so that's an extra level of salesmanship that you're doing, and a little marketing, like I said, that, when you think about your job, market, and when you've gone to graduate school interviews and things like that, and you sell yourself, you really have to think about this as you can't just be technically sound. Right, which it should be. If it is not technical, we love that even better, because then it's like, great.
That's actually, I think, the easiest thing to do.
Yeah, but
outside of
it
formatting, yeah.
Yeah, but if you follow it, you got to follow all of it. But if you don't, for whatever reason, then we throw them out. But then the next level is making that sales pitch and sort of making it clear why they must. And sometimes that means why you're also a little bit different. And so that's hard too, because you've never really been asked to do that so much in your lives, except maybe in the case of an interview where you're being asked to do something like saying, here's why I'm great and unique. And the notion of NSF and being sort of transformative, is like, or USDA has another word for it that's like super innovative.
That's the new word. Innovation is like, they're all over that, USDA. And most of the federal agencies, they don't know what it means, but they want it.
Yeah, they have different words for and they tell the reviewers.
Yeah.
So you can also always download what they're telling reviewers.
Yep.
So that's another thing I look at. But when they're like, oh, please note, like Anna said, please note if the project's transformative.
Yeah.
So I'm sure, first line of my proposal is like, well, this transformative proposal is proposing a transformation of transformativeness. But I mean, I'm trying to make that case, so that's why it's a little bit unique and over the top.
Vocabulary is very important.
Yeah.
I learned with the word media, it has other meanings. I didn't know that when I wrote the proposal, but I used it because I was going for an EPA proposal. Apparently media means other things in the environmental world, which I just didn't get. But I got funded because they loved the innovation with media. I didn't know what I was talking about, because when I started to look at the evaluative piece, I'm like, I don't know what this is. So anyway, but making sure you visited their website, and if they've had webinars, and sometimes they have information sessions, be sure that you listen when you can.
Yeah.
They love to hear their own
Sometimes
work.
it's just as simple as reading the RFA,
Yeah.
RFP, and almost regurgitating back their language to them.
Yeah, and I think that's what it is. You're telling them what to say about your proposal. I think you also want to, the innovation is a pretty hard thing to manage, because it's always a weird thing of you've got to say that what you're doing is novel, never been done before, but also 100% guaranteed to be successful, right? It's a weird line to walk, and so you're trying to assure them that this is going to be money well spent, but also totally innovative. And that requires sort of a balanced portfolio, like a stock portfolio.
Wait, but also using words that make sense. Sometimes people use really big words that don't make sense. If there's a simpler way to say it so that the reader who doesn't do what you do can understand it, because sometimes that first cut is an administrative staff member who's just been tasked with getting rid of half of them.
Yeah.
You know, so I would always say, if you read it and you have to take a couple breaths and you haven't used punctuation, it's really hard to read.
I mean, I agree about that. Yeah, because I do, sometimes I will get frustrated as a reviewer. I'm like, wait, what am I reviewing again? And so our people will do stuff like make the font, they'll go to the smallest size of every possible allowable unit, and that's not always the best case. And sometimes, because there is not enough space in a grant proposal to describe everything. There just isn't. And it's okay, plan to maybe be rejected, because that's the other thing, like we were talking about this before. Rejection is the name of the game in this business. Like if you're gonna go in academics, you're gonna be rejected a lot. Your pubs, your grants, your applications for jobs. Like find a coping strategy now, because there are days when I feel like a complete loser, where I'm like, wow, I can't believe how many times I can be rejected. And so, but what's wonderful.
There's food for rejection.
Yeah, that's right. You start shoving it in, and Coke addiction, Coca-Cola addiction. You know, it's just an ugly, ugly scene. But that could also work to your advantage, because if they reject you, and suppose they don't reject you awful. Like there's two kinds of rejections. There is the, how could you? rejection where you're like, ooh, I'm gonna go out and have a drink now. Because I feel really foolish. But there's also the, well, this was great, but we can't afford it. This was great, but you know what you're missing. And they can't reject you just by saying, you know, this was great, but everyone's ideas were better, you know, or something like that. They have to come up with something.
Yeah,
and they will.
Yeah, and if you resubmit, just, you know, sometimes you don't even get the same team of reviewers, which
Yeah.
drives you even more crazy, because you're like, okay, but I just addressed that. Did they read my first proposal? No, they didn't.
And
They're
the
reading.
stuff
Yeah.
for the graduate, they're never the same.
Yeah.
But what you can do, what I like about rejection, if it's a good rejection, where I'm like, okay, I'm going to resubmit, is that I can say, oh, the previous reviewers noted. There's a little space where you get to address the previous review. And I can say, well, the previous reviewers noted how amazing this was, and how terrific, and how wonderful, and how fundable. However, we did need to address this little thing, which we've totally done, and it's great now, kind of thing. So, and I try to, if the proposal, sometimes they give you a little leeway as to where to put it. If they give me leeway, I put it right up front. So that way the first words they're reading are how other people thought this was amazing.
And yeah, the transmittal letter, that's where you
Yeah.
kind of, that's where you go to confession, right? It's like, okay, here's what went wrong in the first proposal, and this is what we've corrected since.
Yeah.
I use that as like, this is like, seriously, if you don't read anything else, you know that I at least tried.
Yeah. And for me, you know, maybe some people are turning down my writing of how amazing this is. But you do want that enthusiasm to come through, the uniqueness to come through, that they're not going to get an opportunity to fund something like this before.
No one's done.
Understanding the program officer's profile too, because they do. Sometimes I talk to them and I'm like, have you funded a lot of these in New Jersey? Are you looking to fund in other states? You know, and you can ask them. NSF and USDA will sort of talk about what they're trying to target.
EPA does too. You can court them. You can court them for a while. The foundation, same thing. I don't know if anyone's heard of the Dodge Foundation. You have to date them for over a year usually.
The Dodge Foundation is actually several years.
Yeah, I mean that's
It
a
takes
courtship.
several years. Once you get if you get invited to submit something to them, that's a prestigious honor.
Yeah.
Because they're extremely picky, and it takes years to get through them.
And sometimes you can use an idea base through foundations in the state, because we know Dodge Foundation is a well-known foundation in the state. If you go to somewhere else, we went to Toyota, but saying, look, the super well-known Dodge Foundation actually invited this proposal. And on. It's not the fact that they invited it and they rejected it. Right? It's just that this was one of those ideas that actually hit, you know, somebody's. So, you know, there's a social phenomenon. People like to be right. They like to be, you know, that voting phenomenon where you like to vote for the winner. So I use that with the whole, other people thought this proposal was amazing. You don't want to be left out kind of thing.
Yeah. Now, demographics are important. We had kind of talked about it very, very quickly. You probably don't even know where to pull information. Okay, if you're working with people, the census is a good place to start, okay? You want to kind of know if you're working in certain service areas or geographic focus. You also want to know for a federal agency what congressional district it might be, because they're going to probably ask that question as well for impact. So it's important to get like as close as you can to up-to-date statistics. If your best citation's from 1998, it's probably not a very good one. You know, and again, sometimes it's the only one. But I would just do your best to kind of just look through. Wikipedia is not really a good reference. I really try to steer you guys away from that. You'd be surprised. But you want to make sure that the information you get is very good. And sometimes it differs between reporting agencies. We found this out recently. I worked on a very big state grant. And everyone was pulling different information from all over different regions. And we had numbers all over the place. And I said, well, if we all start with the same tools, we should have similar numbers. And again, you know, if you're working with children, kids count data is very important. You know, and again, depending on the type of program that you have, we can also help steer you to some good sources.
And so a number of these students, the other question that I did raise is their advisors are in School of Arts and Sciences.
Okay.
And so the other thing that occurred to me is we can give them what? Or engineering, yeah. There you go. And I just call it, if you're not a CS, you're a SAS, right? There's other schools, and so there are folks in these other schools that also can help, but we can help, and maybe even a little formally can help too.
Yeah, I mean, there are not a lot of other grants facilitation offices, but there are grant facilitators like what Dr. Cronin's role is. The research grant contract specialists traditionally are housed within ORSP, which is the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs. We're kind of the people that are going to make sure you get out the door. And in the case of our office, we're also, like, Dr. Cronin and I get on the ground, we help you write. If we realize that your section doesn't make sense, we can rewrite and overhaul some of your writing.
I'll just give you tips. Or
Or say, have you considered this? Because the RFP clearly talks about these 3 points and you've missed them all.
That's nice, yeah. We need a good facilitator,
Yeah.
you know, and so we've had some really great help here that maybe some of the other places don't.
Yeah.
But I think with that also to remember that because there's also a lot of pressure on all this to be perfect, that we've all handed in sucky stuff. And I've also sat on panels where there've been mistakes, nothing glaring as you mentioned, but little minor mistakes and things like that. The program officer has been like, you know, I don't think I have to correct it. And I've had a program officer come back to me and they're like, hey, we just realized in your current appendix you want this one checked, not that, can you change it? So sometimes you'll get that. For the most part, no. But
once in a,
Yeah, and the quality assurance plan, which we didn't talk anything about, so you guys are looking at me like, what are you throwing on us? The wonderful things about them is if you made any mistakes in your narrative to start, that's where you correct them. And again, I think that's great for federal agencies. They don't all require them. EPA is like notorious for it. And that is like the most that's like you are like when I use the analogy dating, you are dating them for almost 6 months to get that thing approved. You're going through the government process, which you think you're in a good track, you think it's the last draft, and then they send back, well, have you considered this? I'm like, okay, I will consider it now. And again, you're responding. But I would always say that that's where, if you need to do any kind of triage, that's where you triage.
So I don't want to see people, this often happens in graduate yourselves, is you're afraid to get the draft in front of somebody's eyes because it's not ready yet, it's not perfect, it's not right yet, you want to check it again, you found an error, you want to read it again, that kind of thing. Don't do that either. And, you know, I put out things that have made sense. Obviously, the earlier you do it and the less staying up all night that you have to do, the better. So planfulness is always a good thing. But if you have ideas, pitch them. You know, the worst that happens, program officers, I don't think none of them, like some of them know me from the number of ideas I've pitched, and I haven't, and I've been vetted through some of them later on. So I've never had anyone come back to me and are like, wow, you're the stupid person you tried to do 5 years ago. And so I do think you should pitch them, but certainly you have advisors now for a reason. Run the idea by them. But do run ideas by them.
And sometimes program officers, I have found if you're not calling the day that it's due, we'll talk to you. Especially if it's one of those things, they did an information session and the RFA has not dropped yet. That's really the time. If you want to get any kind of time and attention from a sponsor, that's when I've pitched what's going to fly, what's not, because I don't go to their meetings. And that's where I've got, okay, here are the 3 things I'm going to pitch, and depending on this conversation, I'll start prioritizing. I've actually had them walk me through what they're funding. And then I've said at the last minute, okay, we're pulling the plug on these 2 proposals, we're going to throw this one in there. And again, sometimes I've got more than one going at once because I want to increase my chances. Like I said, if you've got good material, you can pull fast. It is hard sometimes to prepare a federal proposal. If this is your first round, you won't have 3 ideas at first. You're going to have probably one that you may have to refine. But once you start building your little pile of unfunded objects, you're going to have the repository to pull from, of great ideas that need a sponsor.
And so that's really, I think it's really important. Also, because a lot of these program officers were people who were working at universities or things like that. who love research and don't really do it anymore, but they kind of want to. So when you talk to them, they're like, I've had these 10 ideas of my unfunded objects in my drawers that I can't pull out.
Yeah.
I can't do them. But boy, if I saw a proposal like this, I can, and they,
Yeah.
they are very enthusiastic.
That's happened more
call-
times than you realize.
And sometimes they call because they didn't get an application from Rutgers. They were just wondering if everything's okay.
Yeah.
And then they're like, we haven't heard from Rutgers. We want to know, if anyone would be interested. I'll give you an example, green chemistry. I'm like, what is that?
Yeah.
So we're like, we'll figure it out. And again, that's when we start playing matchmakers. Like, who does green chemistry? And we're like, no one really.
Yeah.
But we've had situations where federal sponsors have called us and said, we've got a great idea for a project. We've got no one to fly the plane. And that's when we say, okay, well, what are you thinking about doing? What tools would we be using that are federal agency tools, because they love their tools? How could we evaluate? How could we make it like 2.0? Oh, well, have you thought about this? And then they start sending you articles. I'm like, okay, now I got to start reading them. And then you're like, okay, let's see who does this. And that's when we start building our team. I mean, sometimes we put together projects. I mean, Dr. Kopp's been part of lots of interdisciplinary calls, and Dr. Jordan and Dr. Ferrer. I mean, sometimes you don't even know how your team's going to assemble, and you get to a meeting and you're all there with the same idea of getting this out the door, but you've never met half the people in the room.
Sometimes I've met people who've read my proposals, but I didn't even know I submitted.
Has that happened to you, Dr. Kopp? Does that happen to you, Dr. Kopp, where you sometimes go to meetings, you're like, we're all going to try to work together?
And sometimes I didn't know we had. So really, that's what happened once with the program officer. I was like, I didn't know they submitted that. I spoke about it once.
Yeah.
But yes, people, I think, program officers are eager to help. They're there for you. And they do have sort of an agenda that you just figure out and then you try to get in front of.
And get to
and they
know them.
influence.
Like Joe had mentioned, I know this kind of goes on the border of probably HR material, but try to see if they're anywhere on Google. Not where they live or anything like that. I don't want to meet them that way. But the thing is, maybe they go to your church. You just never know. I mean, I have gone to the measures of finding out about family, and then I'm like, oh, how are your kids? How's this? And they're like, they remember me. And then again, you build these relationships, because if you were worth talking to in the first place and they trust you and you can deliver a good project, they're going to come to you when they're desperate and they need some work coming through their agency. You'd be surprised how many sponsors have said, let's go to lunch, let's talk. I've got a couple of ideas. Who do you think can help me do this? So, I mean, these are courts, they last a long time. And the good thing is, a lot of these people that work in federal agencies, they're there for about 25 years. So, yeah, so then they get their pension. Any other questions?
Do you guys have any other?
These are too easy.
So you have your research, last week you had your research question. One of the things we thought you could work on that we'd be happy to look at too, if that research question was one indeed you wanted to try to get additional funding, was to try to send a pitch paragraph to us. And we could help you with that, sort of that initial pitch paper, pitch page, elevator speech, paragraph thing, whatever you want to call it. You can send that to Carrie, Bob, and I, or all three of us, and we will write you back, I'm promising, giving you a sense of what that might be, and also maybe if we need to reach out to Elaine or someone to say, hey, what kind of person is funding this? Where are they funding? What kind of foundation, rather, agency? We can help you with that next step, now that we've seen you all have these modified, beautiful research questions. And other thing to mention is, on a lot of the federal agency pages, the evaluation plans or ideas about how to evaluate your project are also posted.
Yeah.
They do some of that homework for you by saying, we like evaluations to follow the X, Y, and Z plan. That's
USDA
Oh,
is
they're-
notorious for
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
And they have
They
matrix.
actually walk you
Yep.
through
Yeah.
the evaluation piece.
You and stuff, you can download the
Yeah.
template, fill it out, so.
So the good thing about that is if you plan correctly, your final report should be writing itself as you're working on your project. And I feel as I go, I don't wait until the last quarter when I'm supposed to assemble everything. Every single time, whether the sponsor requires it or not, I'm doing a quarterly report, whether it submits or not. Because I want to make sure I'm on track, and I also want to make sure that I've set the priorities for the next quarter, and I want to make sure when I need to start sounding alarms, say, hey, listen, we can't do what we said we're going to do. So as a discipline, so that way when I get stuck with the final report, if I can't convince them not to make me submit it, I've already got a really good start to it.
Any other questions? One thing we did want to mention is, I know most of you, not everyone here, is in the first 2 years, right, of grad school. So the National Science Foundation has the Graduate Research Fellowship Program. And it's a pretty good program. You get a stipend, you get tuition remission. You also become eligible to participate in these other programs that they have at NSF for graduate students. So I encourage you to kind of look into that. It's only, you're only eligible if you're in your first 2 years of grad school.
And so right now, you have to be in your first year.
Right, correct, yeah, because the
But if you
applications
are in
are.
your first year and you haven't applied to this already, should, and you should not develop your proposal at the last minute.
Yeah. But that looks so good. Can I just tell you professionally on your CV, if you get an NSF grant, you're a rock star before you even start. I mean, before you finish grad school. I mean, it is like the flagship of research, I would say. And NIH, same thing. So National Institutes of Health. Those are two very, very prestigious, federal agencies that just look fantastic. Would you agree?
Yeah. And so if you want some resources or on how to apply to that program, or you're just kind of interested, reach out to any of us about that.
And we can help you, even if you get down to you're trying to get a budget out the door. I mean, these things come pretty fast. You guys want to focus most of your energy on the science, what you're going to do. If it's pieces like the internal paperwork, or you just have a question that you've spent way too much time on, call us. We can try to help you. We'll point you in the right direction.
So I think that's pretty much it for now. Thank you guys. Well, that's actually, let's thank